Martha, how are you today?
Good, thanks.
Amazing. Let me just bring up Shane and JP. Hey guys, how are you?
Hey.
Good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So before I kind of get into what we'll be discussing, for a bit of context for the people watching, we actually were supposed to do this panel in the past at South by Southwest. And of course, when COVID hit, that all got moved around. So I'm really glad that we had time to reschedule, and I can see all of your faces, at least virtually, and maybe someday we'll all hang out in real life too. Great. So just to give context for the panel before I have you guys introduce yourselves, when we talk about business, we know that hard work and talent really should be the only things that matter when it comes to creativity, right? But in many unfortunate cases, it's just not the truth. In this conversation, we're really going to dig deep into that and explore discrimination that exists in the creative world, whether that's discrimination against age, minority, women, disability, accessibility, and more. And we'll discuss how a lack of diversity in the creative world leads to a lack of inclusion in the campaigns and products that we put out to the public. So we know this exists, and we're going to talk about ways in which we can hopefully stop it. Before I ask you guys to introduce yourselves, I'll introduce myself again. My name is Beth Wiesendonger. For those of you who haven't seen me so far on the stage, I've been working for Fiverr since 2016. I am the Senior Community Program Manager here, and accessibility is something that's very near and dear to my heart. I am a W amputee. I walk with prosthetics. But tech and accessibility is something that, I'm really fascinated to discuss and to hear others' experiences about. So I'm excited to lend my voice to this discussion here. Martha, can you give us a bit of an intro and tell us about your background?
Sure. I'm Martha Boudreau. I'm the Chief Communications and Marketing Officer at AARP. And I've been at AARP for about 6 years. Before that, I spent 25 years at Fleischman Hillard, where I ran the DC office. But at AARP, I'm responsible for all of our communications channels, which includes the nation's most read magazine, all of our social media, our consumer experience function, basically all elements of communications and marketing wrap up to my business unit.
Right. JP, let's hear from you a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Of course. Thanks, Beth. Happy to be here. My name is John Petty, JP preferably. I am currently the head of social at Wieden Kennedy in New York. Oversee a large team that spans our agency's roster. I've been there for the last nearly 2 years now. And prior to, I grew up at an agency called Translation, which was founded back in 2003. And I spent the previous 6 years there. I'm a Philadelphia native. I have a wife who's my better. Go Eagles, go. I have a wife who's my better half and helps to keep me grounded. And I'm super excited to be here to discuss diversity and creativity today.
Thank you. Shane.
Oh, it's always so hard to actually say what I do because there's actually not one thing. But on the
tell us all, everything.
That's the boring stuff. I want to get into the conversation. But I've been running my own business, the Bon Vivant Media, for the last 8 years. It's essentially a content marketing consulting firm. I do everything in the written and strategic space. At the same time, I also have been on the board of directors for LA Pride and the marketing lead for that organization for the past 4 years, running a number of campaigns and also experiencing a lot of very interesting things in the 4 years that I've been a part of that organization. Prior to all of that, I worked on both the agency side in New York and San Francisco, and then also in-house in corporate marketing and PR departments as well. So lots of different hats that I've worn throughout my career, but really excited to be here with all of you today and also to see all of you, even though we weren't able to do this in person in South by Southwest.
Was really looking forward to that barbecue, I gotta say.
Oh, let me tell you, me too.
I know. I got an invite to a taco bar, and I was like, oh man. Well, I'm very honored to share the stage with you guys today. We're going to jump right into it. And I think I want us each to have an opportunity to sort of say our thoughts on each of these questions. So I'll ask one person to begin with, and then we'll kind of make the rounds. But I'm very, very curious, because we both come from such diverse backgrounds, what all of your thoughts are. So first and foremost, let's talk about creative campaigns and marketing, right? Because we all work for a brand and we all work in the creative space. So when you're building a campaign, or even when you're building your teams, how do you humanize diverse people without making them objects of tokenism, right? Shane, let's start with you.
It's really tough. I think right now we're experiencing this there's more stress on this than ever before. And I don't think there's necessarily a single answer for how you can untokenize different groups. We faced this with LA Pride. We actually faced it very recently when even though COVID forced us to stop all of our activations for this year and essentially cancel Pride, we decided at the last minute, thanks to one of our transgender members of the board, who is also both Latina and Black, brought a very interesting idea to the table. And she said, with all of the Black Lives Matter protests happening right now, why don't we take the date that we originally scheduled for our Pride Parade and set up a solidarity march to stand by the Black community, but also stand by the LGBT Black community. Mm. And we all as a board agreed that that was a great idea. But then through a litany of what I would say unexpected errors, that great idea turned into what I would say is a perfect example of tokenism, where many people from within the Black community and the Black Lives Matter movement thought that we were trying to co-opt the movement, when in reality, the message was always, we want to stand by you. We want to be there with you. We want to show that as an organization and also as a broader LGBT community who is made up of all these different races and religions and gender identities. And, it's really just so much mixed into one community. We wanted to stand by the Black Lives Matter movement. Mm-hmm. But it's very interesting how even something like that, even with the best of intentions, can suddenly snowball into a real disaster. And the reason why I share that example is just because tokenism can happen when you least expect it. And I think there are so many things within the broader marketing world outside of this nonprofit space that I work in part of the time, that it's really hard if you don't necessarily have the right diverse team in place within your own corporation, but also if you don't necessarily have the right diverse team in place on the agency side, if you're working with agency partners, to really understand the true dynamics of what motivates these communities that we're creating marketing for. And that doesn't mean that people who are not within the community can't have a voice and can't have a perspective, but it is very hard to not fall into that stereotypical tokenism. And I think we all have to be very careful and incredibly mindful right now, because everyone's more sensitive than ever to not step on each other's toes.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad that you shared that example. One of my best friends has always had a saying, and his saying is that your intent doesn't negate your impact, right? Yep. So you can approach a situation with the best intentions. You can be thinking that you're covering all the right angles, but if you don't have that authentic team in place and you come from that place of building something with people who are part of that community for that community, it can very quickly get out of control. So I appreciate you sharing that. Martha, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just to build on what you were just saying, Beth, and also Shane, it's the tokenism component from a societal standpoint, as employers, as teams, we have to move past that. I'm just thinking internally in organizations such as mine, in that to say, oh, okay, so we're going to build a campaign that focuses on African American and Black potential members. So let's make sure that we have an African-American person on the team, that they can just give their perspective about the program that's being built.
Yeah.
That to me is tokenism.
Yeah.
And hopefully that was so, internally, hopefully that was so 5-10 years ago, because the fact is, if we're going to create campaigns, if we are going to create messaging that authentically speaks to the people that we need to speak to, we have to have a team of people that where that's their reality, as opposed, we talked about this yesterday, as opposed to looking at all the data points and saying, okay, this is what the Latina community wants to hear. Oh yes, here's all the data points. Okay, let's factor that in. You have to live it and breathe it and understand it to create a campaign that is impactful for those audiences. You can't do it by randomly assigning one person from the ethnicity, from one of the areas of diversity, to what is basically a structured, non-inclusive team and expect the outcome to be what you want.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know, just as a side note, it's Disability Pride Month. And so I know that disability is a very wide term, right? And it's a wide experience. Everything is, because, I don't represent all disabled people.
Yeah.
And therefore, I should not be the end all be all of what that experience is in any given situation. So that makes a lot of sense, right? Just like looking at the data points and having one person on your team who can speak to that, it's not coming from an organic, authentic place again. It's coming from, like you said, that tokenism aspect.
Right.
JP, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, same. And I'm checking along with everything that I'm hearing from all angles. I think that there's a really good point, because, as you can imagine, working in advertising and as we try to craft messages, you fall into a place where, that a monolithic way of speaking or acting is really easy to enable. You think that because this Black person is at the table, then that Black person can speak for all Black experiences. And what we're pushing on, this idea that we're pushing on, I think right now is in order to avoid tokenism, you have to actively listen and actively include. And active inclusion means diversity and perspective. And when you do just like invite one person who you think checks that box, it's a false idea or perception of inclusion, because you're actually one, being supremely prejudiced, and then two, putting a lot of pressure on that one representative to speak on behalf of an entire community. It just ends up being like, your creative or whatever the idea is runs into a wall really quickly. So I'm aligned, and I think we've been talking a lot about this lately. It is tough, to Shane's point, to be able to do that. The steps that you take, though, are making sure that you're hearing your community out and inviting as many seats at the table as possible, so that you can really incorporate the diversity and perspective that we need.
Yeah, and just to dig in on that, I mean, when we talk about creating diverse and creative campaigns, how do you ensure that in that creative process you have those diverse opinions present?
I think you democratize the creative process a little bit. I think you come in. Listen, I'll share a little bit of a story too myself, but I came in from into Wieden+Kennedy, and one of the things you'll hear in that organization is, the work comes first, and then on the other side, it's the perception is, the idea is creative rules, and that could be interpreted in a number of ways. One of them is like, your creative director or your creative partners are going to trump the decision making if it ever comes to an impasse in any given room.
Yeah.
But the idea actually is and should be that thoughts can come from any and everywhere, and it's easy to say that. It's easy to say in your organization, creative can come from anywhere, or if you have a groundbreaking idea, even as a producer who is someone who maybe adopts this idea and embraces the idea well after it's sold or on its way to being made. Like, the thought genuinely should be, listen, we have a problem to accomplish. I mean, a problem to solve and creative to accomplish. And this problem is not exclusive to maybe these 3 or 4 people here. That has to really be a part of the culture in order to get to a place where the work is really reflective of the community that it's trying to touch. And in fact, you want to make sure that you're keeping it honest and putting forth responsible work. So we should welcome that democratization, if you will. Like, we should welcome work kind of just being out there for everybody to contribute to criticize, and to build on. And I think those have always been the best ideas or the best pieces of work. The greatest ideas in history have never been executed by one person or one party. It takes a village, quite literally.
Yeah. Shane, do you agree with that concept of democratizing creativity? And what does that look like for you?
I do, but I'm going to add a different perspective. When you're doing work, and I'm putting on my LA Pride hat again, when you're doing work for the LGBTQ community, you are dealing with a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different people who have lived different challenges. And it's incredibly hard. Well, and even on top of that, what we've discussed at length in our organization is the intersectionality of the community as well. We're not just gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, but we are also Black, Latino, Muslim, Jewish, and there are all these different layers and elements. And that actually muddies the water even more, because there's not a distinct one size fits all type identity. But when it comes to the creative process, while many people would think that adds new color and energy and a lot of just interesting texture to that process, it actually makes it really hard to find common ground. And what I've noticed is that you end up diluting the message or the potential impact and power you can have around the creative you develop, because you get into the position where you're trying to appease everyone. And I think I've also learned that when you try to make everyone happy, you're not going to make anyone happy, and you're going to have something that is that lowest common denominator. So it's a shame, because there have been, and I've seen this play out all too many times, many great ideas that get just killed on the spot, not because of a consensus vote, but because one person had raised their hand and said, well, that doesn't apply to me or my part of the community, so we can't possibly do this. And I think one of the challenges we face is how to bridge, because we're never going to make everyone happy, but how to bridge telling the story of all these different layers while being authentic, while being true to ourselves, but also not being afraid to push the envelope and to allow us to tell some real stories that maybe in some parts might only talk or resonate with one part of the community, but then that means we just have to figure out different storytelling levers that we pull for other aspects of the community. So it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge, and we struggle with it every day. And I don't think there's an answer for, as democratized of a process as we can make it, it doesn't necessarily mean that the creative or the end result or the decisions are necessarily the best ones. And I think that's a challenge we all face.
Yeah. I mean, Martha, I know that working for such a large organization, there's a plethora of opinions and diverse perspectives, right? How do you make sure that you're staying authentic and true to the story that you guys are telling?
Well, it's interesting listening to Shane and JP talk about it, because especially when you talk about intersectionality, which, Shane, that turned such a great term, of all the various components of what make people who they are. And do you play to their gender identity? Do you play to their race, their ethnicity, their socioeconomic level? What do you play to? Ironically, when you get to the 50 plus, they're all the same. They are completely all the same. Understanding there's more than 100 million people over the age of 50 in this country, which is more people than live in most countries in the world. Yeah. Marketers typically say, oh, okay, you're 65, so you wear sweatpants and you're not working. You have no money. You won't try any new brands. And so all very dull. So you have all these people, and they don't see any intersectionality. They look at age and they say, we are going to market this way to the age, or else they say, we're not marketing to that age. That's not consistent with our brand. Now we're starting to see a change there because of the dramatic amount of disposable income of the 50 plus, as you would expect. You work and you work and you work, and over time you accumulate money and then you want to spend it. I mean, it's like $9 trillion a year. And so whether you're Tiffany's and you're wanting to sell something high end, or you're a cosmetics brand and you're trying to build out a whole new market, you have to understand that marketers have to understand that the 50 plus has all that intersectionality that you guys talked about, and then more. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that is common for all of us, hopefully, are going to benefit from being 50 and 60 and 70 and 80. And marketers in the past have turned their backs on this demographic with the belief that they really need, through an acquisition standpoint and a sales standpoint, they needed to go at the much younger demographic to build that consumer base. But now increasingly, and what we're pushing so hard on is that it's not about the age, it's about the lifestyle. Because it's about being active, it's about traveling. Do you know that 40% of the 55 plus are working? The number of 65 plus in the workforce is growing faster than any demographic. And so, there's income there, there's consumption patterns there. And so as marketers look at age as a defining characteristic as a consumer, they're realizing that is absolutely, completely misleading and to a large extent irrelevant. Mm-hmm. It's about lifestyle and it's about attitude. Mm-hmm. So and if you're it's very hard to, the people that worry the most about aging are in their 20s. The people that worry the least about aging are people in their 60s and 70s. And here's just one other thing to consider for those of you who are under 50. There's, over the years, there's been a whole series of pieces of research on being happy, and when are you the most happy in your life? Here's the good news. You are the least happy in your 40s, and then you get happier in your 50s and really happy in your 60s and 70s. Our lives are increasing. Our health is improving. And so, the concept of aging, people are realizing it's not to be feared, and the market is not age-driven, it's lifestyle-driven.
Yeah, absolutely. JP, I want to go back to something you said about creativity can come from anywhere. We're obviously talking about diversity in many different ways today, and one of the ways that we often don't think about diversity is diversity of background and experience. So have the companies that you've worked for in the past, the kinds of companies that always hire like friends of friends and referrals, and a little bit of, always looking for people who fit cultural fit, right? I'm sure we've all heard that expression.
Yeah. This is something that I love to talk about because quite frankly, I am not a classically trained advertiser, whatever that means. I think the thing that we do kind of get caught up on is, and look, I'll say this too. Wieden Kennedy, the agency that I'm on this stage right now representing, is guilty of it as well, and they will be the first to admit there is a perpetual behavior to go fishing or in the same lake and trying to find talent that has a similar trajectory. And we talk a lot about this. I think it happens too everywhere. It's not specific to advertising, but Hollywood is also true. A lot of categories put a lot of value on craft, the idea of craft, and how you get to a place where your craft is just like chef kiss level, and it was you've checked all of the boxes, you've gone to all of the right schools, you've shaken all of the right hands. But the thing is, though, often we're talking about like something that could be viewed subjectively. Right. So like when I can say that's an extremely creative idea. One of my counterparts could be like, I don't see any beauty in this at all.
Right.
And the thing that we need to remember is, you know, especially for people who look like me and grew up the way I grew up, a lot of times we're not exposed to this idea that there's an entire industry built on the messages that we see and hear. Like I remember the first time I was exposed to advertising, it was like something that looked very much like a music video, and it was not a traditional ad campaign at all. So I know that it takes steps to look in other places to find talent. I tell some of my recruiters all of the time, listen, the best copywriters that I know exist on Black Twitter, and they don't have books and portfolios to come in and wow you, but I can guarantee that they can get this job done in a way that you may have never seen before, but that will be equally impactful and even more resonant than maybe someone who's come from, I don't know, VCU Brand Center. I like to pick on VCU Brand Center. They kick out a lot of really good talent, and they know that they're good, so they walk around with a ball player swag. So I pick on them every chance I get. But my point is, like a lot of us don't know that even a place like Brand Center exists for you to help develop that craft in a way, or even like need it. Quite frankly, like we don't, you know. I can speak specifically for the Black and Brown community. Extremely resourceful, very sharp, very creative. We will figure it out. But the barrier to entry for us to play a game whose rules have been written by people who don't look like us and don't come from where we come from are extremely high, and sometimes very discouraging. So yeah, it's on us to look other places to find talent to really show up. You know?
Yeah, and I can relate to that too, because before 2016, I didn't work in tech. And I'm lucky that my manager took a chance on me. Somebody took a risk, right? And I'll be the first person on my team to tell you that I am not a techie person, right? Like I'm so bad with technology, it's awful. But my manager saw something in me besides that, right? And I think that that's a really special skill to have. So Martha, I want to ask you, how do you know in your career, how have you known to take a chance on a hire that maybe isn't coming from the exact, like JP said, perfect background, perfect school, chef's kiss training?
Well, I think that there's one thing that I have always looked for, which is intellectual curiosity. When you're in the agency business, you don't know what client is coming your way. You don't know what creative brief you're going to get. And you have to be able to dig in. I also think that you need to, I've always looked for people that have respect for and interest in variety and in diversity. Because, you know, there are personality characters. You can train for skills. You can train for skills. But some of these base level things, the determination, intellectual curiosity, interesting backgrounds. I remember I worked on Capitol Hill right out of college, and I was there for the better part of 3 years. And then I decided, you know what? I'm burnt out. I want to go sailing. I grew up in Detroit, sailing small boats, and I wanted to go to the Caribbean and sail on tall ships. And I remember my parents saying, "Oh my gosh, how are you ever going to get a job if you leave this job you have and go and try and go back?" So I was like, bye-bye. And I went for 2 years. And when I came back and all the interviews I had to jump back into the workforce, it was the number one thing that people were interested in. They weren't saying, "Oh, tell me about your job on Capitol Hill and are you expert on education policy?" They're like, "Wow, you have the guts to leave and go do that? What did you do? Where did you go?" So I think experiences like that make us interesting people, that show that we're willing to take risks, that we have intellectual curiosity. Now, that for me is what I look for. And then when you bring people in with that, then you say, okay, I need you to be a good writer. And I teach you how to be a good writer. So you need somebody who says, I want to be a good writer. I'm going to do whatever it takes to get to that point.
Right.
Or producer or project manager or whatever it might be. So so I look for those base personality characteristics that are applicable to any situation at any time, because you train for skills after that.
Yeah,
absolutely. And if I could jump in, Beth, that's what diversity looks like. I mean, I think when we talk about diversity, it's easy to talk about, the color of skin or your age or your preference, your lifestyle preference, but background in general is also what helps diversity and real effort toward inclusion. If I know that like your perspective is going to be very different from everybody in this room because of how you got to this seat or how you got to this meeting or how you got to this presentation, then I know that we can account for a perspective that we would not have had if we did not have the experience or access to the experience that you've had. Sorry, I just wanted to cover on that. Sorry.
No, I think it's great. I mean, how many rooms have each of us been in where somebody brings something up and you're like, I didn't even think of that, right?
Of course
like
you didn't grow up on that block or go to that school or quit that job or have to have that conversation,
Yeah. And those moments are great learning moments for us too, right? Like having diversity on your team, it's not just beneficial for the diverse hires, right? It's beneficial for the team as a whole. So,
but can I just say one thing? And Shane, I know you're probably trying to jump in here, but real quick, organizationally, from a culture standpoint, if we're serious, in any organization that is serious about welcoming diversity, about including diverse points of view, has got to have a culture of psychological safety where people can step forward and saying, that's not my reality, and this is my point of view, and not feel like, I wonder if I'm going to get in trouble because I didn't agree with anybody.
Right.
And last week I was on a very active conversation, shall we say, and one of my senior folks emailed me and said, I hope I'm sorry if I'm being overly negative, but I hope you're okay with my point of view. And I said, you know what? In these moments when there's great disagreement, you have to step forward. It's that old thing, right? If everybody's disagreeing or if everybody's thinking the same way, then people aren't thinking. But that's an organizational thing. And maybe if a whole company doesn't have it, then individual groups have it. You have to give people culturally the space to step into who they really are and what opinions and perspectives come from that real place.
Yeah.
So that's actually a perfect segue. I just want to say something super quick here. And Martha, you know me too well at this point. You know when I'm just like
trying to get in.
So I've got a very unique perspective in that I operate both in the United States and France, and used to also live in Australia. But I'm going to talk about the US and France right now. The concept of diversity in the workplace is a very different concept in both of these countries. We're having a conversation right now that is very American focused, and we are much more in the US, especially right now, looking at all of the different layers of diversity and how to be truly inclusive. What's very interesting about a country like France is that you've got this in the workplace. People are almost expected to leave their personal lives at home. You go to work, you have your work life, and everything else at home is at home. And so one of the very interesting things, because when I was at Yahoo, for example, I led up the Yahoo Pride group globally for 2 years. And that was a big deal. And we engaged, all the community, including allies, around just a number of really cool things. As I've tried to engage with the LGBT community here and the tech community and other organizations, it's been a very different story. That being LGBT in the workplace, people say, well, why do we have to shine a spotlight on you? That's your personal life. It doesn't really matter. You can be who you are, but we don't need to give extra priority. So it's very interesting. And I work with a variety of clients, both in the US and in France at this time. And it's very interesting to see how diversity takes on a very different shape. And what I've seen quite a bit in France is that the focus is very much on gender right now, getting a balance between men and women in the workplace, especially at senior levels. Whereas we in the US are really we're still having conversations about gender, but we are certainly having conversations about elevating other minority groups at all levels within organizations. So it's just interesting, and I wanted to shed that a little bit of insight there, because I do feel like I'm straddling two different diversity and inclusion worlds every single day.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense because, this is a virtual event, it's global, and there's global perspectives on everything. So Shane, how have you kind of navigated that as somebody who was organizing for sort of the same cause, but the approach had to be so different from location to location?
I think at the end of the day, it's just being culturally aware of what your surroundings are. Things that we do in the US aren't necessarily going to apply here in France or in other countries around the world. There are cultural nuances, and there's also history. Each country has its own baggage for all sorts of reasons. And, what we've experienced in the US, and, when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, and you've heard a lot of people talk about 400 years of systemic racism in the US, that's not the same story as you might experience in other countries who have vastly different histories. So I think we all have to educate ourselves as we begin to work globally and understand what those nuances are, and also how far you can push the envelope. I think I've noticed with the LGBT community here in France, it's a slower burn. We've, in recent years, especially, once marriage equality became a law in the United States and other protections for the community became law, which unfortunately some have also been pulled back in recent years. But as there started to become more fuel under that fire in the US, we were able as a community to push the envelope more. That's not necessarily happening with the same velocity, even though a country like France approved same-sex marriage far sooner than the US. But at the same time, it's still lagging behind around ways of putting a spotlight on the community or celebrating the community in other ways. Right. So it's an interesting life lesson, and I think we just all have to ebb and flow and adapt based on our surroundings.
Yeah, definitely. JP, I want to kick it over to you because I want to talk about brands' approach to diversity, but from an external and internal point of view. Is your approach to diversity different internally than it is externally? I think, what we've seen recently is that there's a lot of companies who know that diversity is something they have to do, right? It's like a box they have to tick. So externally they promote it, but then internally they're really far away from that ideal that they're promoting in an external way. So how do you change that, and how do you make sure that your approach is the same, both how you're operating inside as well as outside?
Yeah, well, I think you got to have your house in order before you make the bold statements about the standards you want to upkeep for some of your partners and even public perception. And I think the right people internally, they'll help to make sure that conviction that you want to portray is honest, an honest one. Mm-hmm. So I think speaking just personally in my experience, I've had the experience of working for and with some really diverse organizations. Translation is an agency that was started by a former music exec who doesn't understand the rules. He's beautifully ignorant about the environmental conditions of the ad world. So he's built an organization on that, and he welcomes people like myself who are just like, again, not classically trained, I just know I have an idea of what the right creative answer might be. Mm-hmm. At Wieden Kennedy is a little bit different. It's built its reputation on really good creative by creative standard. So, the composition of the company is much different, but it thrives on its diverse composition. We have a lot of work to do still, but I do think, though, if you have a diverse company or group crafting messages for partners who are responsible for, we talked about this yesterday as well, like generational behavioral influence, then you have to have groups that are coming from a bunch of different perspectives contributing to those messages. And when you don't, the work shows. So I can honestly say that as far as my advertising career goes, I've been fortunate enough to work with diverse groups. And if at any point in time they were not, they were really concentrated efforts on fixing that or changing that. So before you make a statement about how, hey, client partner, you guys need to open it up some so that you can be more welcoming or be more inviting to a bunch of different types of people, or people who understand or see the world differently. You got to make sure that the people who are saying that can say it with some credibility. You know? Yeah,
definitely. Martha, how do you guys approach that from your perspective?
Well, by way of example, George Floyd's death, of course, has created and driven some real soul searching inside of different, obviously society-wide, but inside of different organizations. And for us, AARP is a social mission organization. We work for 60 years, we've worked on issues of disparities, whether they're health disparities, financial disparities that disproportionately affect communities of color, and all different types of communities. COVID is hammering, communities of color around the country. We're all over that. So for us, it wasn't about aligning our social mission, with issues of diversity, but rather it has become very much an internal issue where we are reflecting on who we are as an organization. What is the culture that we have? How diverse are we? What are our pay scales? What about our job leveling? How do we have these conversations internally? And, we're a very diverse workforce through pretty much every way that you can measure it. But those are numbers, right? We have X percentage of African-American communities, X percentage of millennials, X percentage of LGBTQ employees, to the extent to which we know, all of these different things. That, though, is the check the box stuff. I mean, what matters is that we have a culture where people can speak to their experience and their life and really be who they are in their professional world. And Shane, it's interesting to hear you talk about in France how, that's kind of, that's your home thing, that's your personal life, and in the workforce, you don't bring that to the workforce. I think that in the US, people, to have a diverse, you have to have a diverse, not just workforce, but culturally embrace that inside of organizations. And if you don't, you cannot speak to that through your marketing. And so we are really, because employees more than ever are not standing for that. They're calling their employers out for having two different standards.
Yeah.
And for going, you can look at what's going on at Facebook in terms of those employees standing up and saying, we disagree, this isn't right. And I think in this moment, employees are more empowered than ever to call out their employers if they don't feel that they're walking the talk that they're putting out externally.
That's absolutely right.
Well, let's talk about that empowerment, because I want to discuss, obviously we've all had the experience of being the representative of a population in a space, right? And how we said earlier, I don't speak for all disabled people, and how nobody speaks for anybody of a certain segment of the population. So at what point do you feel like, your employer should be stepping up to do the work? And at what point do you empower yourself to step up and do the work? And how do you find that balance, right? Because it's an emotionally exhaustive process a lot of times to convince people why you matter and why your perspective matters. So how do you personally sort of balance that? Shane, let's start with you.
Well, my situation's a little different because I'm for all intents and purposes, a one-man show in my day-to-day work life. So I'm not necessarily having to go to my employer. I mean, my employer is me, and having to build the case around why diversity is important. The good thing is that this, if you want to call me a CEO, this CEO gets it. But in my past experiences, and even with the work that I do on LA Pride, I think it can sometimes be a battle, and justifying why people matter, why people exist, and why their existence should be recognized. The fact that we have to continue that fight and have to justify is still really surprising to me. When I was at Yahoo, for example, although that I have to say, during the years that I was there, we made significant progress with elevating issues related to the LGBT community and building advocacy within the organization. And one of my biggest accomplishments in terms of just overall employee support was encouraging, granted at the time, I had to build a business case, which was not an easy task, but I was able to get extended transgender reassignment surgery benefits. And this was in around 2009, 2010, when it was really something that was just at the very beginning of conversation among tech companies, but not really something talked about outside of the tech space. But even then, as forward-looking as companies can be, sometimes I've noticed, and this is with clients that I've worked with who have tried to do diversity initiatives in other capacities, sometimes companies will say, okay, well, we've given you this. Aren't you happy yet? But the fact of the matter is that all of these movements, regardless of what you represent on this broader diversity spectrum, this is a fight that continues to go on. Everyone is seeking equality. Everyone is seeking justice. Everyone is seeking a desire to come to work or just to live their life day in and day out as they are, without feeling threatened or without feeling like they are going to be treated in a different way or spoken down to, or whatever the case may be. And I think the sad thing is we have to keep justifying this. But the fight, I think, is also, and I'll bring this back to LA Pride because I'm trying to wrap all the bits together. It's the fight that keeps us going, and it's the fight that motivates us, and it's that desire to get to a better end place that I think is what makes all of these conversations about diversity so beautiful.
I want to pass the plate around because you were just preaching, Shane. I think you were hitting on all of the right notes for me. I'm over here actually, like, in my head, I'm clapping and I'm cheering you on. I love it. I love everything I hear you saying. And I know, Beth, you want to keep the conversation going, but we've given you this, aren't you happy yet? That resonates so much with me because we're seeing it a lot right now in culture. You see it a lot in organizations when you have a group of people who are like, I'm not really feeling this part over here, or I feel like we can advance or progress this particular thing. And they're like, well, how about this thing? And then it's like, I'm asking for an apple. You're giving me an orange and asking me to be okay with fruit. It's very like, it can come off to be insulting. And unless the fighters are asking people who can empower and advocate and champion for, unless they have empathy, then they'll never really get it. So that the fuel to fight will always be will be the motivating force, and will always be really fulfilling to get up and go to work every day, honestly, the proverbial work every day.
Yeah. Martha, do you want to jump in and add to that?
I just was cheering Shane on as well when he was there. And it's as complicated and as simple as that. People want to live life and they want to be who they are, and they don't want to have to fight for it, right? They just want it to be. And it's astounding to me that in 2020 we are still in what is an aggressive fight to allow people to do that. Yeah. It's discouraging, but we can't be discouraged. We have to keep going, and we cannot
get tired.
And that's why in this moment, you know, when employees are saying, you know what, I'm calling out my employer for not walking the talk here. This is a moment, and there is momentum to be built. And people like Shane and the work that JP does, you know, with his clients, and the work of AARP and so many others, we got to keep going. We have to keep going, because ultimately we don't want people to have to fight. We want them to just live. And I know that's sort of an altruistic point of view, but that's what we're all shooting for. And Beth, you asked a question earlier about, like, what do you take responsibility for versus, you know, companies and brands and whatever. And I think that all of us on a personal level, as well as in our capacity of whatever our job is, you know, whether it's Shane giving high-level counsel to different organizations, or in JP doing the same thing through his clients, we have to use our personal commitment to this through the conduits of our positions to drive towards that outcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just have to say something super quickly. If anyone is paying attention to the comments right now, I've just got to shout out to everyone who's leaving a comment. Some of these, honestly, I almost want to start crying because of how beautiful the comments and feedback have been to the conversation that we're having right now, because it is a real gritty, genuine, authentic conversation with, I like to think of us as real, genuine, gritty, pushing the envelope kind of people. So I just have to quickly give a shout out to all the people who are commenting, because it's really beautiful to see all of the great things you're saying.
Yeah. Oh, we lost Martha. That's okay. She'll come back. We'll get her. Yeah, I've been watching the comments too. And you know, I think that it's nice to see that there's such a warm reception to these kinds of topics, right? Because what we were saying before is, I think we feel more empowered now than we have in the past to maybe be bold, right? And open up these conversations. So I'm really glad that we're here sharing. We have about just a few minutes left, but I want to talk to you guys a little bit about when you're putting something out there and you want it to be meaningful and you want it to feel, like you said, authentic and organic, and you don't want it to be just a buzzword. You know, I've heard a lot of people who are involved in prides of the past who have said, you know, sometimes corporations can kind of Disneyfy what that means, right? When you see pride flags everywhere, what can you do that's radically diverse versus doing something that's just more corporate or that appeases public perception? How do you do that, and what does that look like to you? Shane, let's start with you.
Wow.
It's a big question.
That's one of the hardest questions that I think anyone's asked recently. Okay, here's
I'm here to ask the real questions, Shane.
Here's my off top top of my head answer. I think we're straddling two things here, especially, and let's talk about pride. People love, well, not everyone. I'm just going to say many people love pride. It's fun. It's colorful. It brings out all sorts of parts of the community. And you know what? There's so much beauty in that. But then when corporates get involved, which our organization and many pride organizations have come under fire for, granted, we are nonprofit organizations, and without corporations coming on and supporting our ability to do these kind of events, these events can't necessarily happen, or at least at the scale and be able to touch as many people within the community as we are able to. So it is a double-edged sword, because we love the fact that they are celebrating with all their colors and all their rainbows and everything, but is it authentic? And I think it's actually on a spectrum. Within certain companies, the fact that maybe a company that has historically been homophobic, the fact that that company is doing something and participating, say, in a pride parade, that might be a major milestone for that company. Now, other people in the community who are seeing the pride parade or who are commenting because they don't want corporate involvement have no idea necessarily of how big of a step that is for companies. So I think there's such a dialogue that is missing, because for us with pride, people think it's just one big party. And sure, there is a fun community party aspect to it, but there are so many other layers to pride. There are so many other stories to tell. And I think it's just so hard to put that in a box and say, well, just because a corporate is participating, that it demeans the movement, or it demeans our ability to make progress as a community. I think we have to find, and organizations like our own, but also within our companies, if we are doing diversity efforts, I think we do have to push the envelope towards authenticity and figure out different ways, not just slapping logos on things, not just turning a logo rainbow, but how do we engage people in real conversations? How do we engage people in giving back to the communities who truly need that extra support? And what can we do to make impact? And it's always about impact. And I think that's where, as we move towards out of this year of 2020, which is a write-off year at this point, how do we look towards the future and think squarely about how can we encourage everyone we work with to make a real and meaningful and lasting impact?
Yeah. And just to add to that too, and I'll let Martha and JP jump in after, I went to a D&I summit a few weeks ago, and the woman there was speaking. She works for a very prominent gaming company. And as we all know, the gaming industry has a history of being somewhat problematic, right? So she was saying when she joined, you really have to look at where you are and start there, right? Like meet people there, because you can't come in and expect progress on such an accelerated level that it's not realistic, right? Like you have to meet people where they are. The fact that they're open to it is a step in the right direction. And some of these things that, maybe those of us who work in a political advocacy space would say those are small steps. For those companies might be huge steps, and it might be very indicative of the future and of what's going to change and of what's coming next. So I think that that's a hugely insightful point, and something that we should all keep in mind, as we're empowering ourselves as individuals, wherever we're working or wherever we're at in life. Progress is progress, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't keep pushing, right? But it means that we should be able to see where we've come from and how we've been able to change the narrative. JP, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure, yeah, because I feel it a lot, and I'm super happy to have Shane kind of kick that off, because it does feel like every June it's like, okay, this company who's never ever participated in any of these conversations is now flipping their logo, or we have a rainbow brief in our inboxes or something like that, and that's like I do often struggle with, like, how authentic this is, and I think you make a really great point, Beth. Starting meeting everyone where they are, our clients included, and as you can imagine, right now, and for the last few months, there have been a lot of like, okay, we got to say something about Black Lives Matter, because we know there will be pushback if we don't say anything. So it's like, it's on us to kind of keep that conversation again honest, very honest about, you saying something doesn't really help the thing that we're pushing on. It goes back to we've given you this shit and you be happy. And so the first conversation to have is the very awkward one about how credibly can you contribute to this conversation. That's the first conversation to have. But then two, on the other side of that, I think it's really easy for a group who is fighting for progress to be supremely critical on the outside of that process. So there's a bit of a line that you have to toe, is like, if you knew what it took to get this company to really see the world through the lens of or see like a ground view from a 500-foot level in their ivory tower, it takes literally a lifetime to get to a point where they feel really comfortable. They're making the necessary steps both internally and externally. So you have to applaud that progress on an organizational level, and then hope that they're just getting warmed up, and that you can have incited a conversation versus like started and effectively finished one once the tweet is out, if you will. You got to keep going. and you got to be sensitive to your environment. I agree with all of these points flagged.
Yeah. Martha, what would you add to that?
I would just add that consumer brands are all well aware of the fact that those younger consumers that they're all fixated on are more likely, well, but it's starting to even out with older demographics, but they are much more likely to engage with brands, buy their products, if they believe engaged in the issues that they're engaged with. And that seems very obvious to us right now, especially when you look at brands that know who they are and what their values are. You look at, you know, Ben and Jerry's and Patagonia and even Toyota and other brands that have been engaging in social issues for some time. There is a muscle there for them. They know who they are, they know who they're speaking to, and to your point, JP, it's easier for them to get there and engage. But you know, there's a lot of brands out there, especially non-consumer brands. Yeah. Like, wait a minute, we're in the energy business. We're not in the social issues business. We're not into social change. We just need to deliver for our shareholders. Right. And that is sort of a legacy mentality. And so when you look at those creative briefs that show up in your inbox and you go, wait a minute, these people have never played in this space before. It's probably because, you know, it was a different moment. They're wrapped up in what their shareholder value is. They focus on their employees, and to step into social issues is a very dangerous place. They perceive it as a dangerous place to be. So they take baby steps to do that. And Shane, to your point earlier, sometimes it's just like, oh, here's $200,000, you know, for whatever the issue is that this organization is pushing forward. And, but that's a little step. It's a step. It's, you know what? They could have given it to some other organization, but no, they're stepping into that organization. So I guess as anybody in the agency business, you know, corporate communications, you know, it is incumbent upon, I'll just say us, in the marketing and communications and reputation management world, to be able to create an on-ramp for these brands that is, and we talk about being authentic to ourselves, it has to be authentic to them as well. Some of them will never step on a big stage, but yet they understand that they can have an impact from a societal standpoint, and they're trying to sort out how to do that. Now, there are also brands that don't get it. They just don't get it. And, you know, that's infuriating. And that's a whole nother conversation. But I think increasingly in this moment, brands are realizing they have to use the power of their brand, the significance of their brand to make a difference. Because, back to employees demand it. And you can't get the best talent, let alone the best diverse talent, without having a point of view about those things.
That's absolutely right.
That's totally true. Well, I want to thank you guys so much. I mean, I feel like we could talk about this indefinitely, but it's about time for us to wrap up. So I genuinely want to thank each of you. This was a very insightful discussion, and I know that our attendees today have loved hearing your guys' voices. So thank you so much, and we'll all chat soon.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.